My name is Carrie. I'm 32, and right now I'm carrying my father's coffee while his boardroom laughs about me. We're not at some casual family dinner. This is a business luncheon. Polished men in navy suits, contracts folded into leather folders, the kind of room where deals are dressed up as civility. My father sits at the head like he invented gravity. Sam and William flank him, smirking the way heirs do when they've been handed the map before they earned a step. My mother watches from the side, a practiced silence on her face. Carrie, he says, not even looking up. Bring me another cup, will you, and mind the napkins. You know how women like things neat. The room chokes on a laugh. Sam makes a show of leaning back in his chair, the picture of someone who thinks he's already inherited the future. William raises his glass as if to toast my place, the servant at the table. My hands don't shake. I set the cup down with the exact careful patience of someone who knows how to keep a room steady. I could let it crack across the table and watch the porcelain shatter like a verdict. I could stand up and tell every suit here who I really am. The woman who learned contracts and margins instead of napkins and polite smiles. I could throw the file I've carried in my bag for months onto this table and watch their faces change. But I don't. I smile the small smile they expect, smooth the napkin where he wants it, and pour the coffee with steady fingers. Because the thing they think is dinner, the performance they've rehearsed for years, is only the setup. Tomorrow at noon, there's a business lunch across town. Men in suits, pens uncapped, signatures waiting. They'll talk legacy and buyers and what to do with Adler and Sons. They'll speak about the future like they own it. They don't know. The chair at that other table belongs to me. They don't know the pen I've been saving is already inked. For now, I wipe my hands on my skirt and return to the room where everyone believes their jokes still matter. The reveal isn't tonight. The punchline needs the right stage and the right silence before it lands. The house we grew up in looked, from the street, like every storybook New England home the travel writers like to photograph. White clapboard, shuttered windows, a porch with a swing that creaked in the wind. Inside, though, the rooms carried a different curriculum, one taught in gestures and silences rather than lessons. It was there, between the polished wood table and the varnished banisters, that I learned what I was allowed to be. My father's world smelled of fresh-cut lumber and oil-stained overalls. Adler and Sons timber had begun as a pair of hands and a stubborn pride. By the time I was old enough to understand the currency of respect, it had become the currency that bought our family's reputation. My father's language was simple. Men made, women maintained. He handed the map to Sam and William before they could read it. He showed them where the keys were and where the ledger lived and taught them to nod at boardroom sentences like prayers. When they were 8 and 11, respectively, he took them into the mill and let them push a broom under the pretense of learning work ethic. When I asked to come along, he looked at me the way someone looks at a window, noticing it, but assuming it exists to be admired, not used. My mother was a shadow with a laugh. She could make a pie you'd still dream about years later, and she knew the right way to fold a napkin for holiday dinners. She also knew how to smooth over a raw apology between her husband and their sons, so it would never become an argument worth having. Her silence was not weakness, it was practiced diplomacy. She had learned somewhere early in her marriage that words had a cost in our household. To speak truthfully was to invite disturbance, and a disturbance could risk the peace that kept our names tidy in town. Sam and William were not villains by choice. They were children raised as heirs. They learned very young that to be male in our house was to be assumed competent, to be trusted with the future by default. Sam took that assumption and turned it into entitlement. William treated it like a comfortable uniform he could slump into and never press. They were loved in ways that were blunt and public. Baseball games applauded from the porch, extra allowance for work boots, a space in the garage that smelled of motor oil and belonging. I was loved quietly, a plate placed without comment, a pat on the head like a favor. The gestures that marked us were different languages. I was given the one that told me to silence my ambitions into prettiness. At Christmas or at the annual company barbecue, the choreography was the same. My father would stand, glass raised, and speak of legacy. You know, the company needs men who understand its bones. The men at the table would murmur agreement, not out of malice, but out of habit. Habit, more than cruelty, hardened into expectation. My mother would help distribute the platters, smile a practiced smile, and then retreat somewhere she had made safe. I learned to make my laugh small, to tuck my opinions away in the pocket of a sweater so they wouldn't snag on anyone's pride. The most searing lessons, though, were not given in grand pronouncements, but in tiny, repeatable interactions. The day I asked about a summer internship at Adler and Sons and was told we couldn't risk the sawmill around a young woman, I felt something close to shock. It was not the rejection that bruised me as much as the matter of factness of it. It was spoken like a household rule. Not personal, not cruel, just true. The phrase carried with it the weight of generations. From that day on, I watched how the men in the house used language to shape the world. They named who could be a leader, who could be a defender, who could be a decision maker. I learned to translate my hunger into quieter strengths: patience, observation, a talent for letting time reveal other people's weaknesses. School offered a different grammar. At college, I discovered that people could be judged by competence and curiosity, not by the gendered expectations they had been born into. I learned to code, and the syntax felt like a new religion: logical, demanding, and fair. If a function worked or a query executed, the world rewarded it. My early internships were often awkward, forced into places where I was expected to be decorative rather than useful. But I pushed. I sat through meetings where men assumed my role was to take notes, and I taught myself to take the notes in a way that made them useful. I stayed late. I learned to translate silence into research, into proposals that could not be laughed away. At home, the patterns continued. My brothers would call with the tone of men who expected favors. "Bring me the company van," Sam would ask one summer, as if ownership of vehicles and decisions were a right he had inherited. William would lean against the kitchen counter and reroute conversations toward cricket scores or stock tips when I tried to bring up the efficiency of log sorting systems. My mother, bless her, would deflect, smoothing the edges with tea and a smile. She did not sting with words. Instead, she taught me by omission that self-preservation could take the form of choosing your battles. People sometimes romanticize such houses: close-knit, traditional. I have memories of that warmth, too. There are afternoons where my father would show me a particularly straight piece of timber and tell me why the grain mattered. Not because I was trained, but because he wanted to share something beautiful. There were nights when my mother would bake, and I'd sit with my hands sticky from dough and feel the safety of routine. Those moments were real, and they made everything else more complicated. Love existed in fragments, wrapped inside roles that kept us from speaking honestly. So I learned to be something subtle, resilient in a way that masqueraded as compliance. I excelled at the chores I was assigned because nobody would notice if I did them well. I cleaned the vehicles because they came back shinier, and I learned the routes drivers preferred because it gave me a map of the town's logistics. In the margins of expectations, I collected information no one expected me to want. I learned the names of suppliers like a vocabulary. I sat in the kitchen and cataloged the ways deals were celebrated at the family table. Quietly, I built a ledger no one had asked me to keep. My decision to leave was not a single dramatic moment. It was a series of small renegotiations. The night before I walked out, I watched my father at the desk with his head in his hands over a stack of invoices and realized I'd been practicing the work he valued all along. I simply had not been allowed to enjoy the title. So I packed a suitcase with more than clothes. I packed notebooks full of questions, a few $100s, and a stubborn certainty that the world beyond our property line would not assume who I was before hearing what I could do. Out in the wider world, I was startled at first by the absence of the assumptions that had been a constant at home. Men and women argued about software architecture, offered critiques, and expected results. I learned to speak in a language that measured merit in deliverables rather than gender. It was liberating and terrifying. There were moments of humiliation, of course there were, when men in suits assumed I was an assistant, not the architect of the code. But when someone finally read a proposal I'd written and asked me to expand it, the thrill felt like breathing after being underwater. My mother's silence followed me like a soft echo. Sometimes, in the single hours of the morning when I was tired and the living rooms of my new life felt cold, I would think of her face at the head of the table, the way her mouth shaped apology without saying the word. I would imagine sitting beside her on the porch and telling her that I had not left because I hated the house, but because I loved myself enough to try something else. I suspected she heard that message in the way she watched me the few times I returned home, not with pride loud enough to be heard across the mill, but with a complicated approval that looked like relief. Growing up in that house taught me one unignorable truth. The roles people give you are often the easiest things to accept, but they are also the first things you can refuse. You can refuse the narrative that places you in the background. You can refine silence into strategy. You can turn being underestimated into advantage. That is what I did, slowly and without fanfare. While they practiced entitlement at family dinners and assumed their futures would be handed to them with a grin, I studied other currencies: contracts, shareholder reports, the quiet arithmetic of leverage. The house taught me to polish silver. The world outside taught me how to make deals. I kept both skills. One would make me safe in the moments when others wanted me small. The other would make me dangerous in the moments when it mattered. This is not a story about hatred. It is not even, in the end, entirely a story about revenge. It is the story of a small, steady accumulation, knowledge, patience, and the careful decision to stop being visible only on their terms. The house that raised me thought it had taught me my place. What it had taught me instead was how to build a place of my own. For a few bright months, I tasted it. The little stolen life I had hoped might become my real one. I moved into a cramped studio that smelled faintly of other people's laundry and coffee, signed my name on a mailbox that wasn't my father's, and walked every morning past shops with handwritten signs that meant nothing to the Adams world: new furniture, build quality, local sawmill supplies. I took a paid internship at a small timber engineering firm across town. Not Adler and Sons, not yet. A place that respected the language of wood and contracts in equal measure. I thought, absurdly, that if I proved myself there, if I learned the trade in my own way, maybe my father would finally see it as proof. Maybe he would stop reaching for the old map and notice that someone else had drawn new routes. I never told anyone. Not Sam, not William, not even my mother. Keeping the internship secret felt like an act of decency and self-preservation. At home, work was an inherited thing. At my new office, work was the only thing that mattered. I drafted procurement schedules, learned to read mill grades, sat in on client meetings, and most importantly, I was listened to. The gratification was quiet and brutal. The world measured me by how I solved problems, not by how I folded napkins. There was a small thrill in every first. My first full report. The email where a client wrote, "Thank you, Carrie. Excellent insight." The first time my manager asked for my recommendation in a supplier dispute and actually implemented it. Each small win made me more confident, and with every confidence, I folded the edges of my old life into something lighter and smaller. I started to imagine a future where my name appeared on ledgers and not on labels near the serving tray. Then my mother got sick. It was the sort of thing that arrives like a bad weather report. Vague at first, a cough here, a doctor's note there, nothing at the level of crisis. But I watched the lines around her eyes deepen, watched the way she paused between sentences as if weighing whether to use the energy. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, and said very softly, "Your father thinks I should rest. He worries about me." Her voice was small, brittle with effort. My stomach turned. The decision that followed felt both inevitable and humiliating. I packed a small bag and drove home. I didn't tell them I'd been living away. I didn't say that I had an internship, because admitting that I was carving out a life without their permission would have invited questions I wasn't ready for. Instead, I told them the plain truth that sounded like an excuse and a duty. Mom needs someone. That statement closed the argument before it started. In our house, caring for the mother was a safe script, a role everyone agreed was noble. They welcomed me back with the same sigh of relief they always extended to the person who made the house function. My father placed his hand briefly on my shoulder and said nothing. His silence was a small weapon. It told me he assumed I would do what daughters did. The apartment I had left felt very small when I returned. 6 months of my new life, compressed into the backseat of my car with a duffel and a folder of unpaid bills, felt like a secret buried under the cushions of the living room sofa. I told myself I would be split, two lives running side by side. I would care for my mother in the mornings and answer office emails at night. I would keep my internship tucked inside a pocket of time and discretion. I would be patient. But other people's scripts do not bend easily. At home, my brothers fell back into the grooves they had always known. Sam lounged across the porch like he owned the horizon, and William moved through the house with the assured gait of someone whose destiny had already been assigned. They treated my return as expected, a temporary reset button. At first, their barbs were small and predictable, a comment about my glamorous city life, a smirk when I mentioned a problem I'd helped solve at the office. They joked I must have missed real work, like measuring boards. The jokes were a method of reclaiming territory. They assumed I would acquiesce. I did the household work because it needed doing, and because my mother's appetite for privacy made it easier to step into the role that would keep her calm. I cooked, I folded, I kept pills in order, and appointment cards in a neat drawer. I learned new routines, the exact temperature that soothed her cough, the way a certain tea opened her appetite. I became, in the language of our house, helpful. But every time I bent to sweep or stir, Sam or William would remark about how useful it was that the girls could handle domestic work. The old joke looped in the same baritone. Accomplishment unnoticed, labor assumed. On the days when my internship required me to be present, on a supplier visit, or a late meeting where I was expected to present, I patted my excuses with the same patience my mother exhibited when smoothing family frictions. "I'll be back for dinner," I promised, or "I have a small errand. I'll be home soon." I timed my calls to sound like ordinary errands, a check-in from the grocery, a late meeting that needed early preparation. The duplicity was exhausting but necessary. I was carrying two full roles, and each wore me in different ways. The hurt was not just that they mocked me. It was that the mockery was public and careless, a small, brutal ritual that reminded me every day of the assumption. Daughters belong in a particular place. The worst moments arrived when friends or contractors came to the house. I would watch my father introduce me, if he introduced me at all, with a shrug that reduced my professional identity to a footnote. "This is Carrie. She helps out around the house." A client would glance at me with polite interest and then look to Sam for the real answers. Those were the moments that felt like slow peels of bark being removed. My competence stripped layer by layer until only role and expectation remained. Then came the luncheon with his partners, a day that should have been business and polite handshakes, and which he turned into a theater where my diminishment became a proclamation. Important men in town, investors my father had cultivated, bankers who would shape the next quarter's margins, they sat at his long table, faces attentive, pens at the ready. I had been in the kitchen, bringing platters out, when my father stood with his glass and decided to perform for them. He raised his voice, jovial, practiced, the tone of someone announcing a legacy. "As you all know," he said, loud enough that his partners turned, "I have two children who will carry this company forward." He paused for effect. "Two sons, Sam and William." He smiled and rapped the table with the rim of his glass, as if that action made the statement a fact, a guarantee. The room broke into approving murmurs. The men nodded, their faces folding into the old map where heirs were male and continuity was a simple succession. Something inside me did not just twist, it recoiled. My hands were carrying a tray of coffee cups, and suddenly the world narrowed to the porcelain and the distance between us. The words were not subtle. He had announced to his partners that I did not exist in the continuity of the company, that my blood meant nothing where the ledger mattered. It was the public version of 1,000 small private slights, a formal erasure. I put the tray down in the nearest hands, the server's hands, because the last thing I wanted was to let them see my face choose an answer in front of clients. I could have stood and corrected him. told every man in that room that I had been studying mill grades and had been consulting with suppliers, that I spoke tenderly of procurement schedules. I could have upended the table and watched the ledger fall like a curtain, but the scene I knew by now was his. He loved the theater of fatherly pronouncements. If I corrected him in that crescendo, he would have the stage and the audience. He would milk the moment into pity or outrage. The ugliness of the public confrontation would dissolve into stories he could tell to anyone later. She exploded at my partners. I had no desire to give him a story, so I left the room instead. Upstairs, in the small, clean privacy of my old bedroom, I let the quiet come in and sit with me. The rage that had threatened to spill settled into a slow, cold calculation. This was the world he understood. People who announced futures and assumed them. But there was another world he didn't, one that measured authority in contracts and votes, in signed papers and shareholder agreements. It was the sort of world where a name on a deed mattered more than a voice at a dinner table. If he would exclude me with words, I decided, I would include myself with documents. That night, I opened my laptop and sent a terse email to my manager. I could work remotely until further notice. I falsified no explanations. I kept the secret of my internship intact. But behind that screen, I began, with a steady hand, to plan in a language my father could not publicly ridicule: acquisitions, letters of intent, tender offers. While he rehearsed the lineage of heirs over brandy and lunch menus, I began to learn how to make law and finance do the broadcasting he so desperately desired. He could say I did not exist at his table. I would make sure I existed at every table that mattered next. I had come back to care for my mother, and I did so with the devotion it demanded. But caring for her did not mean accepting erasure. It meant showing up for her, yes, holding a hand, smoothing a pillow, handling calls, and also showing up for myself. The kitchen and the pillbox were not the only things I tended to. I tended to purposes that would not fit inside their neat categories. They continued to laugh. They continued to hand me tasks and expect silence. They continued, in small ways and large, to tell the world I was invisible. But the quiet work I did at night, the calls to lawyers, the spreadsheets with potential buyers the world would trust, the long lists of suppliers who respected competence more than blood, that work began to hum under my skin like a promise. The hurt from my father's announcement did not vanish. It consolidated into focus. I kept my head down in the day, tended to my mother's needs, folded the napkins with care, and at night I let the ledger grow. One day, when the right signatures sat on the right pages, the room where he declared me non existent would have to consider the papers in my hands. The dinner theater would no longer be enough. The stage would have to change, and when it did, I would be ready. The months piled up like stacked boards in the mill, neat, regular, and heavy. For a year, then two, my life became a careful inversion of itself. By day, I was the woman everyone at home assumed I'd always been. The daughter who kept the house running, the steady hand who made sure my mother ate, took her pills, saw her doctors, and did not worry anyone with fuss. By night and in stolen hours, I was something the house did not recognize: a business partner, a strategist, a woman with an alias and a ledger that belonged to me alone. I moved between those two realities like a person walking through doors that lead to different climates. At home, the air was warm with habit and the smell of soup, the conversations revolving in the same grooves my father had carved over decades. Sam and William married, setting up their houses within shouting distance of the mill so they could haunt their father's porch and be summoned whenever he wanted the comfort of the voices he'd trained to echo his own. Their new wives learned the rhythms quickly: oiled laughter, the occasional sharp joke at my expense, the assumption that domestic labor was a daughter's due. They joined the chorus, and it sounded more often than not like the room was full of approval for everyone but me. It would have been easy to let those years flatten me the way sun flattens grain. Easy, but not what I did. The internship I had kept secret from them became more than an internship. The small timber engineering firm that hired me, Hawthorne and Reed, recognized a kind of itch in me they liked: a restless practicality that met details with resolve. They gave me responsibility: procurement schedules, supplier negotiations, the kind of troubleshooting most companies pay consultants to do. I worked under a different surname there, a small camouflage that let me leave the family scripts at the door. Behind that name, I built a reputation not as someone's daughter, but as someone who delivered. I was promoted, quietly. Then, quicker than I expected, I was invited into partnership. It happened like a slow, deliberate door closing. One afternoon, my manager, Mr. Calder, precise as a saw, asked me into his office. His face had the look of a man who has measured things and found them true. He did not congratulate me in the way people on TV do. He paused as if choosing his sentences like planks and then said, "We need people who understand timber, and we need people who understand family owned businesses. You've done the first, and you understand the second in ways most of our team cannot. I want you as partner." For all my secret keeping, that moment brought a small, private thrill that almost felt illicit. I accepted with the same careful calm I used to pour coffee for my father. The partners' agreement arrived with signatures and clauses and the quiet legalese that makes ownership an arithmetic rather than a rumor. I became K. Reed and Hawthorne and Reed's filings, a name that gave me authority without exposing the fact that the woman behind it had a last name that would have made headlines at the mill. I told no one. At home, Carrie continued to be the person who made soup and reminded Dad about his medication. At work, Kay Reed became the woman who negotiated a better supply price and smoothed a contract clause that saved the company tens of thousands. Keeping my two lives in parallel felt like performing a delicate carpentry, each cut precise, each joint hidden. I did not want pity or the sudden invasive generosity that greets a success when people discover it late. I wanted competence to stand on its own merit. If secrets sometimes feel like fragile things, this one felt steady. Part of that steadiness came from guilt. My mother's illness was real and consuming in a way that dinned out any arrogance. I could not, in conscience, leave her alone to chase vindication. So I stayed. I became the person who took her to appointments and then drove back to negotiations, who read supplier reports at midnight and spooned soup at 4 in the afternoon. The dichotomy wore on me physically in a way I could not properly explain to anyone who had not held both a shareholder report and a pillbox in the same week. My brothers' lives, by contrast, were easy and loud. Sam's new house was 2 streets over. William's was closer still. Their doors remained open to the mill as if privilege were an open invitation. They attended every family meeting like men who owned calendars of entitlement. When the company ran a meeting at the house, when my father invited partners and investors to the porch in the dining room, the performances returned. Confident stories over brandy, a display of the familial succession plan as if it were a promise already kept. I carried coffee through those rooms with a smile I had practiced to the exact pitch they liked, their laughter scraping at the edges of my patience. They mocked me, always in that tone people use when they don't quite know whether they are being cruel or clever. "Carrie, you missed a spot," William would say, nudging his chin toward a tray I had just carried. "Aren't you going to take notes on the guest list?" Sam would ask when partners lingered, as if I belonged to the margins. Their wives learned the habit of exchange. A joke here, a knowing eye roll there, until the whole house functioned like a theater that excluded one of its audience members by choice. I learned to let that press against me without breaking. I learned how not to react in a place that demanded a particular smallness. At night, when the house quieted and the refrigerator hummed like a metronome, I opened encrypted files on my laptop and mapped the vulnerabilities my father's company had accumulated under their stewardship. The ledger told a story. Missed orders, a client lost here, an expense hidden there. Their incompetence had cost Adler and Sons more than a reputation. It had cost profit. Companies fail for many reasons: market shifts, supply chain shocks, bad hires. Adler and Sons failed because people who were not trained to run it did, and because an old trust in the family's brand blinded them to the slow rot. I watched the numbers like a doctor watches a chart. Each decline was a symptom, and symptoms could be treated if someone knew what to do. One late afternoon, a week when a new shipment had been mishandled and a key distributor expressed concern, my manager called me into the glass-walled conference room. The city light carved the skyline into a neat row of silhouettes. He did not preface the conversation with small talk. Instead, he sat, steepled his fingers, and said plainly, "We need to buy Adler and Sons." I listened because his words were both opportunity and confirmation. I'd been running scenarios quietly for months. What if Hawthorne and Reed expanded its regional footprint by acquiring a legacy mill? What if they preserved the brand while modernizing operations? It was not only a good business move, it was a move I had the credentials to execute and the knowledge of where to strike. Then he added something that tightened my throat and made the room feel smaller. "We want you to lead the acquisition." Silence expanded between us. He looked at me with a soft, almost familial respect he had not shown before. "And Carrie," he said, the name he knew legally, the name no one at home associated with our firm. "We know who you are. We know Adler and Sons is your family. We respect the fact that you've been managing both sides for some time." There was a dozen things I expected in the moment: curiosity, remuneration, the practicalities of due diligence. I did not expect honesty that felt like permission. He explained what the board saw. Adler and Sons was bleeding under Sam and Williams' casual management. Partners were pulling back, key contracts were at risk. He explained why Hawthorne and Reed wanted the purchase. The regional supply chain was consolidating, and the firm that moved decisively now would control the market narrative later. And then he said, the thing that made my heart both sink and soar: "You're the only person who can do this well. You understand the timber, the people, and the politics. If you want it, we'll back you. Lead the negotiation. Present it as you see fit. We'll trust your judgment." I left that meeting with a folder of preliminary numbers and a steadiness in my hands I had not felt in years. Out in the elevator, the city fell away in quick relief, and the ordinary noises of a world that did not know my name, the hum of the HVAC, the click of shoes, the swipe of my keycard, returned. I was both terrified and exhilarated. This assignment was a match for everything I'd studied in secret and everything I'd tolerated at home. It married competence to consequence in a way that felt almost holy. That night, I sat with my mother and fed her the soup she liked, watching the way her eyelids dipped with drowsiness. I did not tell her about the meeting. It felt too much like hoarding a new kind of light. I was careful and tender. I arranged her pills and unfolded fresh laundry. I did the small, ordinary things that made her day less hungry. But under those moments of care, something else moved in me. A plan shaping its edges, a list of people to call, a timeline that matched my father's lease renewal and the seasonality of their contracts. When I lay awake in the dark, I thought of every small indignity I'd endured: the jibes, the assumptions, the way my father's voice reduced me to a domestic function in front of partners. I thought of the afternoons I'd spent learning prices for kiln-dried boards, of the nights I'd sat beside clients and listened to what they really wanted. The long quiet of that work now hummed with consequence, a takeover that would be legal, clean, and unstoppable if handled right. I was careful not to let triumph bloom too early. Part of me feared that if my father discovered my intent, he would stage a greater theater of denial. Public declarations, threats, the kind of masculine bluster that convinces people allegiance is a thing you buy with stories. Better to be the silent hand that signs the papers when the moment is right. Better, in short, to let competence do the talking. So the years stretched on. At home, I brewed coffee and read vendor invoices aloud when my father asked. At my desk, I structured offers and drew up non-disclosure agreements. My brothers continued their rounds of jokes, their lives arranged like postcards, while I prepared a document that would change the landscape of our family. And perhaps, in the same sweep, change the shape of our relationships for good. When I folded the laundry that night, I did it knowing the folds were not simply for fabric. They were a kind of ritual, small acts that kept the house steady while I quietly took hold of a different kind of steadiness. The path ahead would be messy. It would require legal finesse and emotional stoicism. It would require me to be, in equal measure, tender to my mother and merciless in the boardroom. I did not know yet whether my father would ever forgive me. I did not know if my brothers would be defeated, reformed, or enraged. What I knew in the way you come to know the grain of wood beneath your hand after years of handling it, was that this time I would not be invisible at my own table. 2 years of quiet work had the strange habit of making loud things happen all at once. They didn't know, not really. My father never suspected that the girl he dismissed as help could be anyone worth noticing in a boardroom. My brothers certainly didn't, and they hadn't known I was even working outside the house, much less that I had been given partner level responsibility at a competing firm. In their eyes, I was the safe, shapeless thing you could order to fetch napkins and keep your coffee warm. That blindness was the shallow place I planned to strike. We gathered in the old riverside restaurant my father loved. Low lights, heavy linens, waiters with practiced deference. He insisted on a family meeting with some of the industry men he still entertained, bankers who loved old stories, suppliers who remembered his handshake. Sam and William came early, grinning as if the room belonged to them by inheritance. Their wives fluttered like signed endorsement photos. My mother arrived pale and quiet, the warm center I'd been tending for years. They all filed in and sat, the chairs aligning like pieces on a chessboard. Father at the head, sons flanking him, kin completing the frame. Their assumptions were choreography. I moved through it like a stagehand, pouring water for my mother, smoothing a napkin here, setting a plate there. They laughed at old jokes, they retold triumphs. The men at the table nodded at one another about legacy and what comes next. I listened while I calculated the rhythm of the room, the soft places where a comment would bruise and reveal. I kept my face neutral. They needed to feel invincible. Our contact from Hawthorne and Reed arrived late. Apology practiced into his polite smile. He was sharper in person than he'd seemed on the phone. Quiet shoes, quieter eyes, a presence that didn't demand attention but took it anyway. He carried no pitch binder. He carried a leather case that looked innocuous until he unzipped it. My father's voice filled the room with territorial banter. Well, make your proposal then. Who is this buyer we've heard whispers about? He said, voice glossy with the certainty he'd been practicing for decades. The man from Hawthorne and Reed stood near the head of the table. He didn't begin with slides. He set the leather case down, looked at my father for a single even second, and then, slowly, deliberately, lifted out a woman's blazer. He held it in both hands like a ceremonial object and walked forward. It should have been ridiculous, an affectation. Instead, the blazer had the weight of an announcement. He laid it across a chair beside him, and the room, full of men used to filling silence with pomp, fell to an awkward hush. That is for Carrie, the manager said, plainly without flourish. She'll be presenting Hawthorne and Reed's offer today. I represent the board. They asked me to bring our negotiator. I'm here as witness. The effect was immediate and brutal. My father's smile twitch faltered. Sam and William's faces drained from smug to confused to panicked in about 2 heartbeats. There it was, the first visible crack in their practiced armor. They had not expected a woman at the table to bear their fate. Don't be absurd, my father barked, more to the idea than to the man. Who is she to... He stopped because his voice, which had once smoothed over doubt like wax over grain, hit the room and found only blank faces. For the first time, he did not have a script. I rose. I took the blazer. It fit like cold weather fits a bone you underestimated. Perfectly, plainly, without show. The fabric settled against shoulders that had been used to carrying trays and worry. The room watched me put on a public authority they had denied me my whole life. Who is the buyer? He demanded, trying to clip his disbelief into a question that could be answered with numbers and status. My manager's voice was very calm. Hawthorne and Reed. We're offering to acquire Adler and Sons with the intent to modernize operations and protect the workforce. Carrie will present the terms. Sam laughed, a high, brittle sound. This is a joke, right? You can't be serious. Carrie? Our Carrie? He barked the name like it was a punchline. William leaned forward, face a shade redder than his usual smug. You think she can lead negotiations? She brings coffee in this room. What does she know about running a business? There it was, the cheap, practiced humiliation, tossed like seasoning into the air. Their wives tittered. My father's face tightened the way old wood tightens when it's about to split. I could feel the blood at the edges of my hearing. This was the moment I'd allowed myself to imagine because they needed to be loud for the law to be meaningful. I set out the paper, the LOI, the warranties, the guarantees, neat, clean, and legally precise. The numbers were fair and structured. The protections for employees were ironclad. I slid the leading sheet forward so everyone could see the offer. Then I looked up and met my father's eyes. You don't have to listen to a story, Dietai, I said. You can read the contract. Instead of reading, they insulted. William mimed polishing silverware. Sam suggested I fetch extra napkins for the men. Their laughter rose. It had that dangerous quality of the mob's first ripple. When William called me just a server for the third time, and Sam echoed it with mock theatricality, something small and precise I'd built in another life kicked into place. I'd written the clause late at night in consultation with Hawthorne's legal counsel, a stupid sounding surgical tool designed for this exact circumstance. I pushed the page showing the clause forward. For every public insult made at this table, directed at my person during this meeting, I said, slow enough that there could be no mistake, the purchase price will be reduced by $50,000. They blinked. The sound of disbelief stamped across the long table. Half pride, half laughter. You can't be serious, Sam scoffed. You're bargaining with our legacy like it's a flea market. It's a clause, I said. Look, it's legal. It's quantifiable. If you'd prefer your pride to be worth less than the company's future, be my guest. The first jibe cut, and as it did, the partner at the next table, who had been leaning in with old man curiosity, glanced at the spreadsheet on my tablet and then at the projected totals on his phone. The interface my manager had prepared updated automatically when the insult was logged. $50,000 dropped like a chunk off a beam. Faces changed. Laughter turned thin. They thought it symbolic. They tried again. A wife made a sharp comment about my appropriate place. Another brother-in-law snorted and told a story where I accidentally served the wrong plate to a big client. With each barb, the number on the table fell, 50K, 50K. The arithmetic was ruthless because it was indifferent. It didn't care who they were or what they had expected. It only did what numbers do best, add and subtract with mechanical fairness. My father's face shifted from anger to alarm to a white, embarrassed heat. He had always wielded rhetoric as armor. Now rhetoric was hemorrhaging value. He snapped at his sons to stop. They didn't, partly because men who have never been denied think denial is a farce, partly because their resentment needed the noise. Is this a threat? My father gasped. You blackmail your family at my table? It's an incentive for civility, I answered. Treat the people at this table like professionals instead of props, and the company remains at a fair valuation. Continue to treat me as the family's entertainment, and you'll watch the purchase price fall until you realize how costly your theater was. Sam, who had always loved the sound of his own outrage, rose and slammed his fist on the tabletop. You're insane, he said. This is a betrayal. We built this company. You built it on our names. I interrupted, voice steady as a plane's wing. But you drove it into loss, with negligence and hubris. You left contracts to expire. You let clients slip away. You ran personal expenses through the books and called it management. This is not about revenge. It's about responsibility. It's about whether you want to preserve anything or keep pretending that pride is a business plan. The partners at the table were watching now with the hungry attention of investors who suddenly saw where risk lay. The wives' chatter dwindled into concerned murmurs. My father's hand trembled on his glass. It continued. Insults, legal arithmetic, the slow evaporation of that big round number that had once looked safe on a letterhead. 50,000 here reduced a cushion they had taken for granted. 50,000 there began to cut into tangible things, maintenance budgets, bonus pools, the cash needed to guarantee employment. Their outrage curdled into panic. Words that were once thrown like confetti turned into calculations they could not unhear. At one point in the hot press of hysteria, my father stood and tried to drag me into the old theater, an old man's attempt at public shaming. You will not humiliate me in front of my friends, he roared. I'm not humiliating you, I said, quiet but absolutely audible. You have humiliated yourself for decades. I am offering a solution. Accept it, and you keep dignity and the company intact. Reject it, and watch dignity be priced out of your lifetime's work. He sputtered, then, with the last of his performative authority, said something about betrayal and cursed my name. With each word, the offer fell another $50,000. The room went cold with the sound of cash being eroded by spite. A partner at the opposite end finally broke his silence. He leaned in, fingers steepled. Mr. Adler, this clause is unusual but enforceable. We've run the numbers. If the board accepts this offer as presented, we secure supply lines and protect jobs. If you don't, market opportunists will buy in a week for far less, and the local community will suffer. Which do you prefer? The question sat like a ledger on the table. My father's bravado, which had carried him like a tide for decades, crashed against the practical logic of men who counted payroll and contracts for a living. Slowly, with the grumblings of wounded pride about his shoulders, my father sat down. He looked at the papers, at the diminishing sums, at his sons, and finally at my mother. The worry that had lived in her face all these years, the quiet exhaustion and the small, steadfast love that had held the house together, softened something in his features. Sign it, he said, low and bitter, like a man swallowing a hard truth. My manager slid the final page across. I signed. Hawthorne and Reed transferred the funds into escrow. We established a transition board. We guaranteed the workforce's contracts. I watched my father as the legal reality settled into the same room where he'd once announced the world on the strength of a handshake. He did not forgive me that day. Some things a father's pride cannot hold. My brothers sulked and schemed and tried to find small ways to claw back what they had lost. But the company was saved from their incompetence, the workers' jobs secured, the name preserved on terms that did not let it be pillaged by ego. When silence finally fell, the last fork scraped the china, and my blazer lay folded on the chair beside me like a flag. I breathed the first real sigh of relief I'd had in years. Relief, not triumph. The steady calm that comes from writing something that's been crooked for too long. I met their gazes once, slowly and confidently. My father, my brothers, their wives. Did I win? I don't know, but for the first time in 32 years, I felt right. At the helm, in the place I deserved. Guess how much I ended up paying for my father's company? Each of their insults cost $50,000, and the opening offer was $6 million. How much do you think they drove the price down by refusing to keep quiet? Leave your guess in the comments. Subscribe and stay with me. The next stories will be even more interesting and perhaps even harsher.